Irreverent, entertaining, cool. You're listening to LA Talk Radio.
You're listening to Remotely Unique with Mary Baca, only on LA Talk Radio.
Hi there, this is Mary Baca, and I'm airing today from Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I want to tell you a little bit about myself for those of you that are tuning in today for the first time. I received my undergraduate degree with 2 majors in psychology and criminology, and I have 2 businesses. I have a private practice in psychotherapy private practice that I've had for 26 plus years, and I have a second business. That business is called Odyssey Counseling Services, and I have a second business called Resilience Integrative Services that I started in 2011, which today is primarily a holistic practice. In addition to being a licensed therapist, I am also an applied kinesiologist, a Reiki practitioner, and recently certified to practice hypnotherapy. So in addition to maintaining the 2 companies that I have, up until about 10 years ago, I worked concurrently with different agencies. So I've done child abuse investigations. I was the full-time employee assistance counselor for the post office for many years. I've been director in treatment facilities, serving violent youth and also pregnant teen moms. And I've taught in local universities and also provide trainings and seminars to workplace and offices, and do that locally and even remotely, hence the name Remotely Unique. Within my practice, I work with anyone suffering from depression and anxiety, trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, sexual abuse, grief, just to name a few. So the topic that we're going to talk about today, which is fear, that's definitely something I've seen a lot of people struggle with. I am trained to do EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization reprocessing. It's a pretty phenomenal mode of therapy that helps people move very quickly from one point to another. I've done critical incident stress debriefings for firefighters, police officers, and emergency workers. So I have clearly seen a lot of people who are stuck in a state of fear. And combating things like anxiety. Anxiety, I would say, is, one of the most clear-cut identifiers of someone that's kind of stuck in their fear. I've seen normal, rational fear, and I've seen the extreme condition of fear that can just leave people really paralyzed in states of anxiety and even panic at times. As a holistic practitioner, I help people move through fear mentally, emotionally, and even physically. When people experience fear during trauma, which trauma is one of my specialty areas, their body actually gets stuck in that state and leaves them to replay the experience consciously and subconsciously over and over. Today we're going to take apart this complex issue, talking about what fear is and how to tell where you're at with this issue, how it affects you in your life, and believe it or not, we're going to talk about what the purpose fear has in your life. My guest today is Lupita Gurule de Martinez, who I have experienced firsthand the efficacy of her work. I too have been stuck in fear in the past, and it was affecting me on so many levels. I spent much time seeking help for anxiety, which is a fear-based condition, even taking psychotropic meds for this condition because it was so uncomfortable. Today I am free from the debilitating effects of fear and actually just experience it what I would call in normal doses. I was able to overcome it, and I don't experience it that often, and I'm able to address it fairly quickly and keep moving forward. Our show today is called From Fear to Freedom. And before I bring on Lupita Gurule de Martinez, I want to give you a very humble bio on her. Lupita is a certified medical support clinical hypnotherapist, a spiritual advisor and life coach, specializing in self-empowerment and personal transformation. She has extensively studied indigenous forms of health and healing. She is a Stanford University School of Medicine certified master trainer for their suite of self-management programs where she teaches people life skills so they feel better and improve their quality of life. Lupita has a private practice in Santa Fe. She is phenomenal and amazing. She has touched thousands of lives throughout her career, including my own. Lupita helps people transcend obstacles that are holding them back so they can live thriving, happy, and functional lives. It is with great honor and respect that I welcome you to the show, Lupita.
Thank you, Mary. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for that very beautiful introduction.
Yeah, absolutely. How would you define fear?
Well, the first thing I think is extraordinarily important for people to understand is that first and foremost, they are not their emotions. I know that when we're in it and we're experiencing it, it feels like that's who we are. Especially when there's the fear, and there's a whole spectrum of fear. So as you've mentioned already, the extreme forms where it's like a form of paralysis, where like unable to move, unable to make decisions, unable to make the changes that they want and need to make in their lives, versus the sudden onset of fear. And so fear itself serves a really unique purpose, in that it is a way for our body and our mind to communicate with us so that we can make changes that we need to make. Now we're going to talk about the entire spectrum of fear. And so fear, first and foremost, is an emotion, but it also is a biological and a biochemical and a psychological reaction to stimuli in our environment. And so we can talk about the three different types of fear. So the first type of fear is a sudden response. It is where it's like our brain's alarm system. It's triggered by sudden emotions. Maybe there's a loud sound. Anything that can threaten our sense of safety and survival in the immediate. And our brain is hardwired to recognize these potential threats. So it's oftentimes, say we see a spider or something jumps out at us that we're not expecting. That's that type of fear. And that it actually has created this biological chemical reaction in the body. So first and foremost, we have the part of the brain, which is called the amygdala. And the amygdala is the part of the brain that is on constant watch out. It is our alarm system. If I had to compare it to something, it would be like a smoke detector in our houses or places of business. So it's on and it's in the constant background. It is sensing our environment to see if there's anything that we have to respond to instantaneously. And when that does happen, we have a flood of biochemicals in the body. So the amygdala sends out this alarm system throughout the body, and then our body sends a signal to our adrenal glands to secrete biochemicals such as adrenaline and cortisol and a number of other stress chemicals so that our body could immediately respond. So that's the first type of fear.
Well, one of the interesting things along those lines is perception is everything. So sometimes people will sense there's something to be fearful of when that's not really even reality.
Exactly. And so when we have a buildup of this in our system, so many of us are in a constant state of that fight or flight. So in our daily lives, and especially the way society is set up, that we're managing an extraordinary amount of stress in our everyday life, just to get up and go to work, to get our kids off to school, to run our businesses. There's a multitude of things that we're trying to cope with. And so our body is already having this steady secretion of all of this adrenaline and cortisol and all these other chemicals that lead to a hyper sense of a lack of safety. So anything that sets it off, and especially our mind. So when we're dealing with having maybe a difficult situation, or maybe we're having a life change for some reason that's causing a lot of stress, perhaps a loss of a job or a loss of a relationship, a loss of a loved one. All of those things add to that constant feed of our brain interpreting that we're in a constant state of distress. And so when that happens, you're absolutely right. Anything that sets off that fear center is going to be exaggerated and extreme because we already have it flooding our system.
Right. Well, and I think that sometimes people don't understand that we're such a complicated and interesting thing, our bodies. And so, if we perceive that something is to be feared of, all that whole physiological process that you just described kicks into place.
Exactly. And then there's the sudden instant, the sudden onset. So like an alarm blaring. And then we have the more subtle, the more prolonged, but also the more debilitating forms. So that type of stress is where there's like a sudden thing that we need to respond to instantaneously. The second type of fear is this long, drawn-out fear, which is a feeling of dread. So an example of that is, say, we're in a job that we don't particularly care for, or we're working with difficult situations in our life. We're committed to having to go to that place, say the work environment. And where we have this long, drawn-out feeling that is like a concept, a build-up of all of this tension. And so, again, being in that place of the adrenaline and the cortisol and all the biological responses and the neurological responses, so that adds to it as well. It's where we're anticipating and expecting something bad to happen, whether it's real or it's imagined. So, and this is a fascinating thing about the brain. So one of the things I study being a clinical hypnotherapist is the function of the brain and how the brain actually works. Our brain is able to perceive threats, whether they're real or imagined. So when I talk about that, it's like, is it something that is observable by others? Or is it something that I'm just thinking about constantly in my mind? So we're constantly either in fear of what has already happened, okay, which conditions us to, to expect something bad to happen. So an example is, say, a person who is dealing with domestic violence. They're already conditioned for the expectation of something to go awry. And so there's this long, drawn-out feeling of dread. And so when something sudden happens, it goes into even an additional type of a fear response. And
right.
Then what you've also... Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I see a lot of people who have that anticipatory anxiety, whether it's that they have a fear of driving. And so, there's all this lead up to them actually having to drive in terms of anticipating, having that anticipatory dread.
Mm-hmm. And the body automatically responds, right? So it's just that they're not even driving. They're not even in the vehicle yet, but their body is already responding as if it were. So their palms begin to sweat. They get the tension in the pit of their stomach. They begin to feel nauseated, lightheaded, a little bit of dizziness, perhaps headache. It can affect their vision. The body is already responding to those states of fear, and the action hasn't even taken place yet. So that's when we get into that paralysis, and it leads to all sorts of either medical and psychological and emotional impacts that really affect our day-to-day life and our quality of life.
Right. Well, yeah, because a lot of times people are so disconnected from what's going on with their body. But if you pay attention when you're feeling anxious or fearful, if you pay attention to what your body is going through, you will definitely identify sensations that are going on and changes like in, heart rate and things, the other things that you mentioned too. So that's always really interesting, I think, for people to realize.
And this is a really perfect time to actually talk about this, is that when I said at the very beginning that we are not our emotions, that is a really powerful and impactful statement, that I am not my emotions. And when we are in a state of whatever our emotional state is for a prolonged period of time, we tend to misunderstand, thinking like, well, I'm just a fearful person. Well, you're a beautiful, extraordinary, divine person, who is experiencing fear. And when we can understand that it's something that is not us, but something that is communicating to us. So that's what we would call emotional intelligence. So when we have emotional intelligence, we can become aware of, what am I feeling right now? Well, my body is responding this way, but what am I thinking? What happened right in that moment that made me shift to feeling this physical reactions as well as like emotional reactions, right? So we can develop our emotional intelligence to understand it, and when it happens, then we can perhaps respond in a very different way. And so we can build. The beautiful thing is, the answer to it is that we can actually come up with ways to solve this. That it can be manageable, no matter where you're at, in the spectrum of fear. That we can just begin where we are and then make it better. So by developing all of those, there's a lot of skills and techniques, and I know that we're going to talk about that a little bit later on, in terms of how we can even manage it.
Right. And, along those lines is not owning it. Like, semantics, wording is so important. So saying I feel fear instead of I'm fearful, I'm anxious, that's like taking ownership. That isn't always, a positive thing to do, rather than stating a feeling. And emotions are transient. They do move, they do, we do move past them, through them, and past them.
Exactly. Anything that follows the statement, I am, we're actually declaring it. We're owning it. We're saying that that's who we are. And then our brain operates in different levels. There's the conscious, the subconscious, and the superconscious. And so whenever we have that kind of languaging, it's called neurolinguistics, it actually plays a role in our brain and how our brain responds. So you're absolutely right, Mary, that when we're talking about like I'm fearful versus I'm experiencing fear. So understanding that, being able to create that detachment and not claiming it as if it's our own, because then we begin to the self-fulfilling prophecy. Like I'm in constant fear, then we're surprised when we're in constant fear. So by being able to understand that and just paying attention of the thoughts that we think and the things that we say can make an extraordinary difference.
Absolutely. That's the most powerful place we come from, is our thoughts.
Exactly. So the mind-body connection, right? So we can, again, using that example of the driver, who's afraid to drive, isn't even in a car, isn't even behind a wheel, is already experiencing the reaction as though they are, because of the thoughts. So our mind knows no difference of what is actually happening, what is a memory, what is created, and what is like an irrational fear from the future of something that hasn't happened yet or may never happen. Which that's a perfect introduction to the third category of fear, which is anxiety. So when a person is experiencing anxiety, an anxiety happens whenever we're unable to confirm whether a threat is real or false, whether it's imagined or actual. In other words, is it even going to happen? Like, so much of our fear is based on the unknown. So an anxiety creates another layer and another level of stress, that again already has those biochemical reactions that we've already talked about. So our anxiety is our brain's default setting when it comes to the unknown. And again, which is, it may not even happen, but yet it's already having an impact and affects how we feel.
Right. Yeah, and that can be such a debilitating state of being for a lot of people, and really, really immobilize them to where some people can't even function that have anxiety.
Absolutely. Which is the perfect way to describe. So what happens in the body and what happens to us when we actually experience those levels of fear. So the very first thing, as I've mentioned, the amygdala alarm goes off. It sends the information to our body to secrete adrenaline and cortisol and other stress responses. And what it actually does is it stops the blood flow from from the brain. So in the brain, when we're studying it, that right behind our forehead, is what's called the prefrontal cortex, and that is where we have higher thinking. We're able to analyze. We could problem solve at a much greater level than we can otherwise. And so when we are in a state of high stress and this fear response, it actually shunts blood to the brain. So imagine back in the day when our ancestors were dealing with, they were hunter-gatherers. And when they were out hunting, say they came across back in that day, maybe a woolly mammoth or a saber-toothed tiger. Someone's not going to sit there and think like, oh my gosh, I hear a noise. Should I go left or right, or should I stay where I'm at? By the time they think it through, they're already gone. So this way, it actually is the body's response so that it can actually help us to manage fear. So it shunts blood to the brain, which is our thinking capabilities, and we immediately go into that, this is commonly known as the fight or flight response. There's actually 3 different ones. There's fight, flight, but there's even a third one, which is freeze, which is do nothing. So in the fight mode, we immediately go into a stance of aggression, to be able to defend ourselves. And then in the flight mode, we turn and run, get the heck out of there, just dash. And then the third one is to freeze. So if we think about like the deer in the headlights or, other animals that are completely frozen in motion, so that they throw off their predators. We too have that same kind of response. So and people may think that it's a sign of weakness, but it's actually a very highly evolved response to fear, which is freeze, do nothing. And so, but that impacts our lives. So there's the negative side to that is where we don't make changes that we need to or want to make. All of those other things that we were talking about just a bit earlier.
Right, and just kind of being paralyzed in that. I work with a lot of people who fit into that category, and I think half the battle is being able to identify it, because some people don't know that is fear, that maybe was caused from way back to childhood. They don't get that. So it's nice when you see the light bulb go on, and that that enables people to start taking necessary steps to move past this stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's extraordinarily important to understand, is that people might be, feel guilt or feel shame because they're having this kind of, perhaps in their mind or others observing them thinking that, well, that's irrational. Just get over it. What's the big deal? There's no problem here. Like, I don't have that response, so come on, get with it. The thing is that because our amygdala, is experiencing all this, it's actually monitoring and observing. So let's talk about this for a moment. When we are experiencing a heightened state of fear, there's a function of the mind where it seems like everything slows down. It's called like flashbulb memory, where it's literally taking pictures in high detail of the experience, because our brain is hardwired to be on the lookout. So it's gathering information so that when we come across that same experience in the future, then it gives us a warning signal like, I know this. I'm not going to be in that situation again. So it begins to be on the lookout for us, right? But when it's irrational, using that term, it could, again, create that sense of freezing, that paralysis. The other part is because the mind operates with a conscious awareness as well as a subconscious awareness. So we're gathering constant bits of information, whether we're even aware that it's happening or not. And so when our mind is perceiving our reality and experiencing a heightened state of fear, it's storing that information for us. So we might be having a fear response and not even understand why we're experiencing it or where it came from. And just as you mentioned, it could have happened, something that when we were in 6th grade. So a really good example of that is, say, someone who is an adult now has a fear of speaking in public or speaking in groups. That's a pretty common thing that happens with people. And then not even understanding, well, I'm safe. There's no reason for me to feel unsafe with these other people while I'm giving this presentation. So why in the world am I so afraid? when in reality it could be something that happened to them when they were 6 years old. Maybe they were in first grade or in first grade or kindergarten, where they were learning their words, and maybe they were embarrassed in front of the group by the teacher. So it's a heightened state of emotion, a person of authority, and a highly emotionalized situation, right? That the brain has taken in that situation as something that it should be on the lookout for. So this poor person is now an adult. It's an integral part of their job, but yet they feel and experience that heightened sense of fear because of something that happened so long ago.
What's so interesting is when I do EMDR with people, you're able to actually witness them going through these different states of arousal and these different patterns of fear. And then as they work through that and get through to the other side, it's phenomenal to actually be able to kind of freeze frame that and watch a person move through that by when I'm doing EMDR, which accesses the amygdala, that part of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
So that's pretty amazing.
It is amazing. And I think that there's beauty in that, because then the person can understand, like, I am not my fear. I'm having a fear response. I don't know where this fear is coming from, but I can do something about it. And when they can understand that they are not their fear, and that they don't have to blame themselves for this response that they're having. So, like, on the opposite side, when we're not dealing with, like, a sudden, immediate sense of danger, like, that stuff is real. Fear serves a purpose. Fear can actually save our lives. Say we're driving down the street and a child runs out into the street, and instantaneously our body responds without us having to think about it, right? So that we have those responses there for a reason to save our lives. It's when it impacts us on a day-to-day basis, that will really impact us. So I'll use myself as the example, because I think fear is part of the human condition. I mean, it's there for a purpose. And I would venture to say that just about every single person on the planet has experienced this kind of paralysis with wanting to make change. So this type of anxiety, right? Fear of the unknown, not knowing what's going to happen. And I, too, have experienced that as well. And so it wasn't just fear, okay? It was like sheer on terror. So before I went into private practice for myself, I worked full-time for about 23 years, and I had this deep desire to go into practice for myself. But I had an irrational fear that I was not going to be able to survive. And I had to be able to break it down as, like, what is the absolute worst thing that could possibly happen? Say I do quit my job and the income from my private practice isn't coming in. What was I so terrified about? And so when I was able to break it down to myself, thinking, well, okay, so I don't make my mortgage payment. So are they going to take away my house? Does that mean that myself and my family are now homeless? Do I not have family that would be willing to, house us for a temporary moment till we got our feet back on the ground? So that I had to actually identify what are all those fears out there. So, like, I had this fear, and it was this blanketed general feeling, but then I really had to understand, like, well, what is the fear? And then when I finally actually did break it down, I realized, like, well, that's irrational. I'm not going to die, and at the time that this originally came up for me, I did feel like I was going to die. Like, if I didn't have my steady, regular Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 paycheck, that I would die. And when I was able to break it down and understand, like, all these different irrational thoughts that were floating around, I was able to address them.
Right, by kind of taking it apart and looking at it from different angles.
Yes. So creating distance from it, first of all.
Right.
So understanding that, okay, I'm having this fear response for a reason. It's trying to communicate something to me. What is it trying to show me, teach me, or tell me? And then pick it apart. So oftentimes having someone to voice that with, like through your practice, Mary, of, psychotherapy, being able to have those steps laid out and addressed and worked with along with someone that can help us, have that second eye, that can be extraordinarily helpful. That this is something that we can begin to understand today, and that we don't have to blame ourselves, that we're having this physical response that is on autopilot. It's not that we have said, like, I want to be in fear. Nobody that I've ever talked to says, I want to be in fear, right? And so when they can understand that, it's like my body is on autopilot. My brain is efficient, and it's trying to help me. What is it trying to help me understand? And so we can make peace with the fear response, and then understanding that there are indeed steps that we could take to make it better.
Yes, absolutely. And that's a hard part sometimes for people to get to is, and we're going to talk about next week is, okay, so how do you overcome it? But first, like you're describing, to be able to break it apart, it's kind of like, I'm going to date myself by saying this, but, back in the day, there was a game called Asteroids, and it's kind of like blasting that asteroid apart, so you can look at the parts and then address each one, instead of just feeling overwhelmed by the whole of whatever's causing the fear,
Exactly, because that's where the paralysis comes in, right? So, like, I am so afraid, I choose to do nothing. And so when we get into that place, then that has such a detrimental effect on our life, because then it leads into all sorts of secondary responses. Then we do feel guilty and shameful for not doing what we really want to do in our lives. We feel like we're missing out. We don't have a sense of joy or purpose in our life because we're afraid to pursue it. Begins to impact our relationships because maybe we're afraid to do the things that we want to do, and other people don't have the same kind of understanding. And people do not understand our experience from our perspective. They're seeing it from an outside view. And from an outside person looking in on a person who does have fear, they don't understand. So we have another dilemma where they don't feel supported. So their family or friends or their coworkers are looking at them, like thinking that this person is behaving irrational, and the person who has experienced is probably beating themselves up because they think it's irrational. But then again, the paralysis sets in, and there's the lack of support, the lack of understanding, and then a person really goes even deeper within. So when they have prolonged feelings of anxiety, which could lead to depression and also physical reactions. So because of our society and how it is, our day-to-day lives, the craziness that we're trying to manage every day, the majority of people operate from that place of heightened stress and heightened stress response, because we have like tons of adrenaline coursing through our body every single day. And when that happens, then we begin to have physical effects. We could have, chronic fatigue. It could lead to adrenal burnout, which is a huge issue and so misdiagnosed and underdiagnosed because people aren't even looking for that. So when people begin to feel tired and cranky and irritable and, stressed, and they're having restless sleep, and it leads to all kinds of different complications, which even compounds it even worse.
Well, and I do a lot of work with people on adrenal fatigue, using supplements and different aspects of kinesiology, because, the symptoms on the symptom list are included anxiety and depression. And so if they go to a doctor and describe those symptoms, the doctor usually gives them an anti-anxiety or antidepressant medication, when really they might be having an adrenal imbalance because of the various levels of stress that they're under. But, as you were talking too, one of the other things I wanted to say is that fear, like it can be paralyzing. It also can snowball. So for example, like when somebody's afraid to be rejected, and of course they're not going to be telling people that, but they're going to have all these behavioral reactions and physical reactions. And so it might look like them pushing people away and not really being talkative. And so how the public, how, like you said, the outside person is going to view that and perceive that and judge that to be, then just ends up compounding the problem, because, then people might avoid that person, and that further instills kind of the paranoia or feelings about, okay, people don't like me, and it just becomes this vicious circle that really could be, nipped in the bud if the person realized that this irrational fear was going on for them and be able to address it.
Exactly. And I love what you just said. They're using that example. And so it does become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if a person is afraid of rejection, right, and then they behave in ways that almost guarantee that a form of rejection, right? So if someone is withdrawn, if they don't, if they're not outgoing, they're not overly talkative, maybe in a group situation, they might be like feeling left out because they weren't invited to a social gathering, which is a form of rejection. And so or they might, because they're afraid of being rejected, they might be the rejecter from the onset.
Right.
In other words, they'll be the ones that push themselves away, as you mentioned, so that they won't be rejected. And then, again, that self-fulfilling prophecy, then they'll say, well, look at my life. Look at these situations. Look at all these, the evidence and the proof of why people reject me, without understanding that, like, this is something that could be addressed and looked at and worked through, so that their responses are different and their behaviors are different, that can assure a greater response, for them to be having inclusion versus exclusion. And so there's all of those bits and pieces as well.
Which I think that when somebody's willing and able to talk about these things, they're able to even realize like how irrational it sounds as it's coming out. But for people that don't, take the step to talk about all of this to somebody, then it just swirls around in your head, and it almost has a life of its own, in terms of how magnified it can get.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So there's layers of being able to address this. So like you said, first thing is being able to identify it. And then the second thing is having, a form of treatment. So maybe that's something that they can engage with in themselves, before it gets to such a progressed level. Or maybe they can identify that they are at the level that they do require some additional assistance. And I think one of that you probably experience this in your private practice too, Mary, is where there is such a stigma about counseling and therapy and psychotherapy, and where it's highly misunderstood. I think it's starting to become more accepted in our society, that there's nothing wrong, and in fact it's the exact opposite, that it takes a lot of courage and strength for a person to be able to say, I can't do this anymore and I need help. To be able to ask for help, and then also take those extraordinary steps to seek out help, and oftentimes, we might be able to talk to a friend or a family member if we're lucky, but then they don't have necessarily a different skill set to be able to help the person along. So that's something also that's extraordinarily important, so that we can interrupt the pain cycle and the symptoms, the fear cycle, so that they could, help themselves before it gets any worse.
Well, absolutely. And I think one of the things that plays in there is the messages that people get as children about seeking help. Sometimes people are brought up with a belief system that, what happens behind closed doors stays behind closed doors. Or if somebody's really had a lot of invalidation of their feelings as children, then oftentimes it's hard for them to seek help or talk to, seek help from anybody, from a pastor, from clergy, from a
Mm-hmm.
counselor. I think the stigma is changing, though, and I base that on the fact that, most counselors that I know are pretty busy. So I think that it is slowly changing, but definitely needs to evolve more. I had a
Mm-hmm.
question for you. How can someone tell where they're at in the continuum of fear? Because, there's some extreme cases of fear, like a person who's having panic attacks frequently. And then there's, on the lower end of the continuum of fear, there's somebody who might be having some irrational thoughts, but, aren't aren't severely reactive in some way. So how can somebody, do you think, tell where they're at?
Okay, this is perfect because I love talking about this subject. So emotions, again, when I talk about emotional intelligence, it's about helping a person understand that their emotions is another form of language. It's about helping us to understand that there's something that's trying to be communicated to us and through us by how we feel, the sensations of our body, and the emotions that we're having. And the sooner we can identify what those emotions are and what those symptoms are, or the sensations in our physical body, the sooner we can interrupt that fear cycle, right? And so it's going to be really important for a person to have a high state of self-awareness. Now, it's something that can be developed. It's not something that is actually taught. These are new terms out there that people are beginning to understand and talk about a little bit more, but is about emotional intelligence, and it begins with ourselves. So we have intellectual intelligence, which is, knowledge and our skill set and our education and all of those other things. But there's a whole other layer of that emotional intelligence is by understanding what emotions are. So if we think of a spectrum of, say, joy or happiness, it can go anywhere from just like a really subtle level of contentment all the way up to pure bliss. And just like fear, it could be that, again, that absolute I'm stuck in frozen paralysis into this, on the other end of the spectrum, where it might be just like a one-time sudden onset kind of thing. And what we're talking about here is identifying the symptoms of this prolonged type of dread and also this feeling of anxiety. So sometimes it begins with the feeling of that something's off. Something's not quite right. I'm not feeling myself. And that's like our first signal to ourselves that's something that's like the warning sign, okay? Oftentimes it starts very, very subtle. It's not a sudden onset. So like in the reverse of having a situation where it's immediate, imminent danger, deal with this right in the instant versus this prolonged, drawn out. And again, it starts with that feeling of something's off, something's wrong, something's missing. I'm not feeling like myself these days. Even family members, coworkers, or friends might say, like, "Are you okay? What's going on?" And it's so elusive. That's part of the other dilemma, is that it feels like we don't even have a handle on it. We can't even understand it, so we can't even begin to describe it to somebody else, much less, ourselves, much less somebody else.
Well, and it might be really hard to pick up. So, like, even somebody who settles for mediocrity in their life, there can be fear at the basis of that. Or somebody who lacks motivation, who typically might be described as lazy, might have some fear issues, that keep them from being able to take steps to, live a fulfilling life, or somebody who ignores health issues. So it is elusive, and it isn't always easy to even identify that there is that going on for someone.
Exactly. And symptoms that I might be experiencing may be completely different than what somebody else may experience. So it's extremely important for us to begin to know our base. So what is our baseline of emotion? And this is the beautiful thing about it, is that we are meant to feel the entire spectrum of emotion. I think that oftentimes, especially in this day and age, where that you hear a lot of buzz about like enlightenment or people who are seeking, their self-improvement, is that we're supposed to be like okay 100% of the time. And so for a person who's not feeling okay, might be more adept to keeping it quiet and not talking about it because, they're not doing well. And so that's the other part of the stigma, is being able to understand that we are indeed meant to feel the entire spectrum of emotion. So if someone's angry, then let them experience that anger, because that anger is there to show them and teach them something. And in this specific instance where we're talking about fear, is that it serves a purpose. And there's an incredible book out there that is actually talking about the benefit of fear. And I'll have to get the name perhaps for the next show, but it's actually talking about how fear and our fear responses actually do save our lives. And there's many different situations where people have ignored that sense of fear, because we were, especially for women, we're supposed to be polite and, we don't, reject people. So when our gut instinct, when we feel that sense of fear come up within inside our gut, maybe where we step into an elevator with another person who gives us the heebie-jeebies, it's there for a reason. And studies have shown that where extreme situations have happened, especially the majority of these being women, unfortunately, is that we disregard those feelings that come up because we're afraid to seem impolite or whatever the case might be. So fear serves a purpose. And so it's about beginning to understand what is my base, what is my basal emotion, okay? And usually, we want to be in a state of neutrality, to be in a neutral state, a place of just being content. And then from there, if we begin to see that we're dipping below that to, no longer doing the things that we like, things that brought us joy, and that this also can look like depression as well. So fear and depression can tend to go hand in hand. So the sooner we're able to identify that I'm not feeling myself, the sooner we can begin to explore what are the causes.
Well, the interesting thing is sometimes people have lived like that their whole life. So it's not really even, like if they have early trauma in their childhoods and they've had fear be a basis of their existence from very, very early, they don't even realize that there's a difference. But the other thing too I wanted to say is that where I have seen it be debilitating is when somebody has experienced trauma and so they stay stuck in that anticipatory fear where there no longer is a realistic reason to be afraid, but a person has a hard time getting past that, and sometimes is so resistant that they just won't even make any attempt, which is difficult.
Exactly. And with that being said, is that so the subconscious mind, as we talked about, the subconscious mind is storing all of that information for us so that it can be preventative for us in the future. And then another part of it is where, the person is experiencing this, and as you've mentioned, that is their basal state. And so when they can actually identify that, there can be something different. So then it requires a lot of different steps, but being able to move out of it. And that's the beginning step, is just understanding that that's where they are. And this is the other part of it, is having an acceptance of where we are. I am in this place and it's okay. It's temporary, that this is not going to last forever. On the reverse, so for people who have had those experiences from a very, very early on in their childhood, that might be the way that they might be approaching it, but then also understanding I don't have to be here forever, then I can make those changes. And again, it's about building up skills and attacking it from all different angles, that what may work for one person may not necessarily work for another, but then they can give each of these modalities approaches and then give it time to be able to work through. And so being able to identify, am I in the place of fear? And I think that you said that perfectly, is, for a person who doesn't want to make the changes in their life because they're afraid to, or stays in the relationship far longer than they should, they can begin to explore what that looks like, and then, and understanding that it's a process. I think that's the other part. We have an unrealistic expectation of ourselves and of others that just get over it. Once you start talking about it, it should go away. But for some, it could be, that it is a process. And as long as they're taking some kind of measurable step to feel better, they can begin to incorporate those things into their day-to-day lives. So in this particular talk today is about what is fear, how can we identify it, am I in it, and then begin to just ask themselves those basic questions. Does that apply to me, and what does it look like for me?
Well, and one of the things too, and you mentioned earlier about emotional intelligence is, we live in a society that's so not about getting in touch with what you feel, that is so avoidant of that. And that's really, really important. Fear is not a comfortable feeling to have. And so sometimes people get afraid to feel fear. As funny as that sounds, it becomes this compounded emotion, and then the reaction to that. So the whole thing about emotional intelligence is a really important key to the start too, is to realize we do have a broad spectrum of emotion. It's not restricted to just happy, sad, angry, the typical ones that are referred to. Like I usually give people a sheet of emotions, and actually they're like, it's 2 pages long, of all the different positive and negative emotions we can have. So, that's really interesting. All of this whole topic, and that's why I wanted to talk about this today, because I see a lot of people struggle with fear on a daily basis. I would say that if there was one common thing, there's several common things that people struggle with. Fear is absolutely one of them. And it's time for us to start wrapping up. But next week, Lupita is going to come back and join me again, and we're going to talk about how to overcome fear. Now we've taken this out, put it on the table. It gives you time to think over this next week about where you fit into all of this. Expect that you fit into all of this, because we all do. Fear is just, a normal thing that can become abnormal if you avoid it and don't deal with it, but it is a normal state of being. Did you have anything you wanted to say in closing, Lupita?
So I think you're absolutely right. It's part of the human condition, and that we don't have to be afraid of our fear, as crazy as that sounds, that it is there to serve a purpose for us, that it saves lives, and it also can help us and push us to that next level of feeling better. And when we understand that we are not our emotions, but our emotions are there to show us and guide us and to help us along the way, that we could make peace with it. So when we come to a place of acceptance, then we're in a better position to be able to cope with it. So the next level of like, okay, I am here now, so now what? And I love that I'm invited back next week so we can actually talk about the now what. What's the next step? And
right.
Not just theoretics, but actual steps that people can tangibly take and actually do to help themselves. So I'm really excited about that as well.
Yeah, and the great thing is that if you missed the show today, you can download it or listen to it later in the podcast section on iTunes. I'll also post it later on today on our Facebook page, Remotely Unique. Please visit our page and like it when you do. And next week we'll be back on Channel 1, LA Talk Radio, 12 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. Listen, learn, and overcome anything that's holding you back from being the amazing person that you were meant to be. And we look forward to having you again next Monday. And like I said, Lupita will be back with me. You guys have an awesome week.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mary.
You're listening to Remotely Unique with Mary Baca, only on LA Talk Radio.